I had a lot of fun recording this video, interviewing recording engineer producer Elliot Scheiner. Elliot has 25 Grammy nominations and 8 Grammy wins. He's worked on such classic records as Van Morrison's Moondance and Steely Dan's Asia. His discography reads like a who's who of the record business. Beyonce, Foo Fighters, Sting, Clapton, Steely Dan, and the Eagles, just to name a few. I first met Elliot when I started working at A&R Recording. He had just won his first Grammy for Steely Dan's Asia. We were both trained by Phil Ramone, so we've got a few Phil stories in here. And this part 1 covers his early career and getting started in the music business. I'll put some links down below to a Spotify playlist that covers some of the songs we're talking about and his Tune Tracks drum library. Thanks for doing this. I got a bunch of questions and I'm going to forget half of them. And, a lot of it to me has to do just with recording history. So anyway, I got to start at the beginning. Obviously, now there's a million recording schools. Everybody wants to be a recording engineer. But I'm real curious as to how you got that desire and where you learned about recording engineering as far as that it even existed.
Okay. It didn't. I didn't know anything about it. I don't know if you remember my uncle. He was a trombone player. He was, a studio guy. He was on all kinds of jingles and records. At some point, well, for me, it began when I listened to Sgt. Pepper. And I read the album jacket as I was listening to it and saw Jeff's name on there, Jeff Emmerich, and listened to the whole album and thought, oh, fuck, this is what I want to do, and didn't know anything about it. But my uncle called me up and he said, what are you guys doing tomorrow? Why don't you come up and see a session? So we went up to A&R, and it was in Studio A on 48th Street, the old A.
Right.
And we sat there while they were doing a Winston commercial, and the room was filled. It was a 4-track date, and it was filled, and there had to be 30 guys in there. And we just listened in awe. And I didn't know what to do after that. So I started doing research, and there really wasn't anything you could do. There was nothing that offered how to record. In those days, you needed to find somebody who could be your mentor. But I didn't know that at that point. So what I ended up doing, I went to a school. I've never told anyone this, because I've always been embarrassed that I actually did this. I went to a school, it was called RCA Institutes of America.
Yeah.
It was run by RCA and NBC.
I used to see the ads in the back of like Popular Science and stuff like that.
So I did that. I went there for 2 years, got a background in electronics. And when I got out, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it meant. I knew stuff, but I didn't know how it would relate to actual recording. So when I got out, I called my uncle again. I said, I made the decision because I was playing at the time. I said, I can't do this. I'm never going to get anywhere doing this. I want to record. I want to learn how to record. And this was October 10th, 1967. And he said, okay, I was the 9th. He said, I'll make a few phone calls, but open your day tomorrow. So he called me back and said, meet me at A&R at 112, same place you were, at 9 in the morning. And I went up there, and this time I actually met Phil. And he introduced me to Phil, and he said, let's go talk. And at that point, I was a hippie. And I looked like Abby. Bell-bottom pants and stupid flashy shirts, and I had apple seed necklace. You know, it was all like nobody was dressed like that, but it was the only form of dress I had. So I put it on, and Phil said, "Tell me what you know. Are you a musician?" I told him, "Yeah," and it was all great. And he said, "Okay, can you start tomorrow?" I said, "Yeah, I could start today, you know, but tomorrow would be good." And we're ending up, and he said, "Be here at 8 in the morning. I'm going to introduce you to Mitch Plotkin. He'll be your guide for the day." And I met Mitch that day, and Phil said to me before he left, he said, "What are those things around your neck?" I said, "It's an Appleseed necklace." He said, "Wow, can you get me one?" And then I said, "Yeah, I can." He said, "And could you dress more appropriately?" And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And he said, "Well, a jacket would be good. You know, if you have chino pants, that would be good." Well, I had both, but only one of both. So I got dressed up that morning. Even I wore a white shirt and a tie, like everybody else.
Yeah, Phil was always wearing a tie in those old pictures.
Right. I go in the next morning, and I was broke. I had no money. And Jay Messina is there, and Mitch, and a guy named Norman Jensen, who was actually the studio manager at that building. And Mitch looks at me and he says, "What do you want for breakfast?" And I looked at Mitch and I said, "Well," knowing I had not much money, he said, "Yeah, I'll have coffee." And he said, "No, we don't want to eat." Well, no, okay. And he said, No, what do you want to eat? Do you want steak and eggs? What do you want?" I said, "Well, I don't have money to pay for that." He said, "Don't worry about the money. The studio will pay for everything." And I sat there in disbelief that they were going to pay for my breakfast. So Mitch showed me around the studio that day. The very next day, there was a guy named Danny Griffiths, and he was Phil's second, or he was kind of everybody's second. He was a really good guy, very smart. Really, I was doing a day with him and Phil, and he showed me how he set up for Phil. And I was basically learning how to set up. And everything was pretty obvious the way he was describing everything. And that was it, really. You know, I did that for about 6 months.
Now, when I started, one thing that was great about A&R was, like, you tended to be trained by one engineer. And the great thing about that was you could get his clients from the overspill when you worked your way up. But like Ed Rack and Tom Gritto, were your assistant. I assisted Boyer and Phil. Were you assisting one guy, or were you bouncing around with different engineers at that time?
I bounced around, but only 3 guys. Phil was primary, and then I would go to Don Hahn, and then a guy named Dave Saunders.
Yeah.
But I spent most of my time with Phil and actually learned how Phil felt about everything. And he was still in that curmudgeon stage where, if you did shit bad, he'd let you know it.
Oh, I know that.
Yeah, he wouldn't always let you know in front of a client, but after the date, he'd let you know.
Yeah.
But he'd hit me with stuff. I remember doing, at some point during that 6-month period, I was working only with Phil. And he hit me one day with I'm doing an album with a trombone player, and it was called 21 Trombones. And it was Uri Green who was the major lead. And I knew my uncle was going to be on it too. And he said, Phil said, I've never done anything like this. How would you set this up? Do you have an idea? And I told him how I wanted to do it. And he said, okay, sounds good, do it. And I set up the whole date, and he was fine with it. It worked out fine. And from that point on, it was only Phil. Whatever Phil did, I was his second. And at some point, about 6 months, we were doing a Jimmy Smith date in Studio A in the old building. And it was one of those dates that would start at 7 and finish at 10 or 11. And we got set up together, and yet you remember A&R, that there was probably a jingle in there the next morning. You had to break everything down.
Yeah.
And there was no way to keep anything on any of the faders. It was A had a Langevin broadcast console for tracks 1, 2, and 3. And then track 4 was an Ampeg mixer below the console. And most guys use that for overdubs. So we do the date, and it's cool. I break it down. Next afternoon, I set up for the evening date again. Everything's good. Break it down. Set it up on Wednesday. Everything's good. And that day, at about 7:15, and Phil was always there by 6:15, 6:30, and he wasn't. And I went to his office, started looking for him, calling numbers, calling the switchboard. Nobody'd seen Phil. And at that point, I'm not sure what to do. And then he calls in at 5:07. He said, look, I have a problem. I'm going to need you to do the date. I said, I can't do that. And he said, yeah, you can do it. Don't worry about it. Just Joey, I'll see you later. And he hung up. And I was sitting there knowing that, or feeling that I couldn't do this. But, I watched Phil those 2 nights and saw how he was handling the faders, what he was writing. And it was mostly Jimmy. Everybody would be pretty much preset for a song except Jimmy. Jimmy would be, he'd ride Jimmy. And that was it, I got through it for that night, and he came back on Thursday and Friday, and I was a second again. But he wanted to give me the opportunity to do this. And apparently that's what he did.
Yeah. Yeah. No, he was great that way with people, the amount of people that he shoved forward. And, I think one of the great things about Phil was I was more afraid of him than I was of the task that I had to face, as far as, doing. So I was like, oh, I got to show up. I got to do it. When you first started A&R, a lot of big names came out of there as far as engineering. Was Shelley Yakis there or Bob Ludwig? Were they still there?
October 10th, 1967, Shelley and I started that day.
Wow.
Yeah. And a week before, Bob Ludwig started.
That's amazing. I'm unclear about one thing I've never gotten, which is there was the original A&R over
Jim and Andy's bar, which was a
Right.
musician's hangout. And I think A&R even had an intercom run from the studio down to the bar so they could call musicians.
And then they took over Columbia Studios, which is 799 7th Avenue, A1.
And it also had Studio A2. And they had 322 West 48th Street, which had Studios R1 and Studio R2.
What was the timeline of those transitions?
Well, when I got there, my first day there, they were already almost done with 7th Avenue. They had already worked on A. A had a console in there. It was all set to go. And soon after, he started working in A at 7th Avenue. 322 came when we lost 112, which was, I think, either 69 or 70. They bought the building, 322.
Oh, I didn't know they owned it. Wow.
Yeah, they own the building.
And did they build those rooms from scratch? Because they were built like brick shit houses. They were tough.
They were built by Neil Munsey, who was a designer at that time, a guy from Canada, who also built Studio A2 and supervised in A1. Also built Mix 2, Mix 1. So he was the main guy for Phil. And but 322 didn't come until we lost 112.
Now, in my research, it's just amazing. I went through a lot of your 627 credits on Discogs, and Phil's credits don't even. It's just insane to look at Phil's credits.
Yeah.
And so, was there any records that were memorable to you that you worked on with Phil? Because I couldn't find any credits that linked you and Phil.
Yeah, well, in those days, seconds never got credits. Right. So yeah, when they still had 112, as I started working with Phil at primary second, I remember one day we were doing Dionne Warwick with Burt Bacharach and Hal David, and that was like amazing to me to be in the same room with these guys. And it was Studio A. I think the room was actually maybe 25 or 30 by 35. It was small. And there were 2 vocal booths on left-hand side as you looked out to the studio, and they were very small. One would house Dionne, one would house background singers, and the rest of the band with strings was in the room. Drums, everybody was in the room.
Yeah.
And we worked on that. That was Do You Know the Way to San Jose?
Wow.
And, and I thought it was a bad song. I never liked it. But it was I was blessed to be there with Phil and Bert and Hal, and they were so nice, so really nice.
There are stories I tell younger people, and they just think I'm making them up.
No, we were fortunate. I mean, we studied and learned everything we knew at a historic time for music and bands, and learned how to record from guys like Phil the way it was supposed to be recorded. And nobody knows that now, but I love the way it was back then.
Yeah, and another thing about Phil too was, it's sort of like to work in film, there was a whole science to it, a whole discipline. To work in video, a whole science, and Phil did all of them. So now it's all in Pro Tools. There's time code, there's video, but you used to have to know your shit.
You did.
And that was a great thing about working with Phil, was he could work in pretty much any arena. And the other thing I loved working with him too was just, he sort of joined, like, when I was young, I thought it was a little square, but he still connected me to that history, that musical history of knowing all these great musicians and all the great people that he worked with. It was really amazing. You seem to fast track pretty much to an engineer. Your assisting period looks like it was relatively brief.
Yeah, it was short. when Phil gave me Jimmy to do that night, after that, I was still doing assisting Phil, but in '68, I didn't have many clients. I didn't have anybody. And at that point, Jamesina was working in the cutting room on the second floor of 112. And he was cutting, back in those days, people weren't taking tape copies, they were taking discs.
Yeah.
So, and Jay was great. I mean, Jay was a master. And he was he said, I want you to go down with Jay now. I want Jay to teach you how to cut a disc, cut a lacquer. He was masterful. I mean, he was great. And he taught me how to cut, or tried to. And I could never get the thing that sucked up the lacquer. I couldn't ever get it.
Yeah, the back, yeah.
And it would just be all over
the place. Yeah.
Yeah. So they didn't leave me in there for long. And I went off trying to get clients. And they were good in the office. If a guy was busy and they couldn't get somebody, well, we have this other guy, you might like him. And so you'd get the spill-off from guys who were super busy. I didn't get much spill-off from Phil. Phil would work 20 hours a day just to keep his clients.
Yeah, that sounds like Phil, definitely.
Yeah.
So, all right, so I look at your credits, and then what blew me away was the first one was the Guess Who, These Eyes. I mean, iconic song. I mean, what do you remember about cutting that? And do you know what room you cut that in?
That was A2, and I wasn't the engineer. I was engineering at that time, but Dave Green, who had just come to A&R, he was hired from Canada, and he was friends with Jack, who produced the Guess Who, and they were brand new. Nobody ever had heard of them. And they came into A2. It was one of the first new dates in A2, and it had a Neil Muncy console. Everything was Bakelite faders, round Bakelite faders. And so I was seconding, basically. And as we cut these eyes, it was 8-track, but they had a bunch of overdubs they needed to do on the remaining tracks. And it was either Dave or Jack who plays tambourine. I said, well, I can do that. Well, okay, we'll set up a mic for you. We need to play tambourine on this. Great. And I didn't think anything of it. Never even heard of the band.
Yeah.
So I think I did it once more on another song. But yeah, I never actually recorded them. But the band, we became great friends. They were around my age. Burton and guitar player.
It was Burton Cummings
And Randy Bachman.
Right. So we became great friends. And I said, I've never been to Canada. I was thinking maybe I'd drive up there in the summertime to see you guys. Where do you guys live? And they were living in Winnipeg. I didn't even know where Winnipeg was. So I drove up to Montreal. And Montreal's not one of the greatest cities. They don't like you if you can't speak French.
Yeah.
And I stopped to a gas station. I asked him, how do we get to Winnipeg? And me asking that was like somebody coming into a parking lot in New York and say, how do we get to L.A.? The guy looked at me, and he turned around and just left. And I found it from a cab. Take you days to get there, so I never saw them again.
No, that's very cool. And I don't think people know you're a percussionist. And I actually recorded you once. You probably don't remember. It was at the House of Music and Phil and Boyer were producing an act called, I think it was Witcher and Cartwright, and you came in and did percussion overdubs for us, and I recorded you.
Oh, I remember that. What was the name of the band?
Witcher and Cartwright. They were pretty cool, but they were just out of their time zone. You know, they should have been like 10 years earlier or 10 years later. Now, also, and I'm going to put links below. I'm going to add some photographs into the video. I'm going to put links below for some sound samples and tune tracks and other stuff. But, you know, I listened to Jay and the Americans Capture the Moment. That's a pretty cool record. It's got some cool sounding stuff on it.
That's where I met Steely.
You see, you're answering all these questions before I can ask them.
They were the music directors for Jay and the Americans. Donald played piano and Walter played bass.
Oh, this is great.
And they got the band together, rehearsed, did the arrangements, and I didn't know them at all. And they came in there and we recorded the tracks. That was the very last thing I did with Jay and the Americans, and stories that I won't go into, and I was happy to be done.
Yeah, but I think of Jay and the Americans as that really polished, singy pop 60s stuff, but there was some kind of cool stuff on that record.
I don't remember.
Yeah, no, there was, and there were some good sounds. And then we get to one of the records that made me want to become a recording engineer, which is Van Morrison's Moondance. How did you get hooked up with that? Any stories about that?
It was one of those, you know, they didn't care who they had. The producers were supposedly his managers, Bob Schwade and Jack Merenstein or something like that. They were never there, but they originally started the album with Shelley, and Shelley did a couple of cuts, and then they moved on to Tony May, I think.
Yeah.
And Tony May did one cut, and then I did everything from there on. And Van and I sort of became friends, and they said, well, I want you to mix the record. And I became friends with the band. It was a great thing, you know, working with Van. Didn't know if what we were doing would ever be worth anything, you know.
Yeah.
I think it took about 5 years before he went gold. But in those years, they only cared about being played on FM. And he was getting a ton of play on FM. When it came time to mixing it, actually before, I went up to Woodstock for the festival with Van. Of course, we were working. He said, do you want to come up and we'll hang out at the festival for a day? And we did that. And I came back and we did some more work. And then at Christmas time, the album had to be mixed. Warner Brothers, they wanted it mastered in January. So I spent all of Christmas mixing. And I asked if he was going to be there. He said, no, it's Christmas. I have a wife, so you'll have to do this. You can send me a tape copy. At some point, we were into tape copies that year. And I mixed the entire record. I never heard from Van, ever. Not at all, except when it was done, he said, here's a sequence, A side and B side. I need you to master it. And obviously, I didn't do that, but a guy named Dave Crawford came in, who was mastering. He was learning from Bob, and he mastered the record, and that was that. I cut that record in R1.
Wow. I was going to ask you, yeah.
It had, what was that? It was a Telefunken console.
Neumann. There was a Neumann.
Yeah,
There was a Neumann in there for a while.
it was a non console. It was an 8-track console. The tapes were 8-track, so it was fine. Um, it had inline EQ, which we had never had before.
Yeah.
And, all we had during the time that I was growing up there was you had one 670 and two EQP 1As. And that was that. And you had to be selected what you use it for. And it was really, Phil had taught me, don't think about using that. If you make a mistake with using compressor, you'll never get it back to the way you want it.
Oh, I could tell you a funny story kind of about that, which was and I'm not going to interrupt you, but I was recording. It was the first record I was engineering for Phil. It was a band called Get Wet, and this girl went from a tiny voice to a belt. And I'm recording her. We're doing vocal overdubs, and like she opens up, and I pull the fader down. And Phil gets furious. He spins the chair around, shoves me aside, sits down in the chair, goes, "I'll show you. Do it again." Grabs the fader. She's singing. When she goes into the belt, he pushes the fader up and buries the needle, right? And of course, you play it back. There's no distortion. It's a voice. You know what I mean? And he goes, "See, that I can undo. What you did, I can never undo." So it's sort of like the compression,
Yeah.
It's funny too, because that Fairchild was sitting in the back of R2 a lot, and I remember we hardly ever used it.
Yeah,
It wasn't God,
he had taught everybody about writing. The most important part was writing faders.
Yeah.
And that's what everybody did. And now you look, nobody ever touches a fader, ever.
Oh yeah, I mean, and again on that same record, my early experience, we were tracking the band, and the band came in for a playback, and Phil got furious at me, and it's because my hands weren't on the faders during the playback. I wasn't riding the playback, and he just let me have it. So yeah, it was, and I think there's a very cool lesson in here also, in that if you think about somebody now, musician or producer, engineer at home, and they've got an 8-channel interface, they're pretty much in the same ballpark that you were when you were back in R1 recording Van Morrison with an 8-channel desk. Like, do you remember, just for some tips as far as so this guy wants to set up a band in his basement and he's got 8 inputs. Like, do you remember how you mic'd the drums? How many drum mics you used?
Yeah, I think I misworded. It was an 8-track output console, but the console, I think, had 32 faders.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Well, R2 had what, 24?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, the old Suburban Sound console, that console.
Yeah, that was Neil Muncie, yeah.
Yeah. I don't remember how many channels, but in any event, you're still going to 8 tracks. Do you remember, like, from your early recordings, like, where you had a more minimalist drum miking situation?
Yeah, on Moondance, all the drums were on one track. So your balance had to be good enough so that you could play back to one track and you'd hear the whole kit.
Yeah.
So drums were always, that was the first thing you did, or at least I did, get the drum sound. And the drummer was amazing, and he just stayed with me. Can you do this a little different? And nowadays, you wouldn't go up to Steve Gadd and say, "Hey, could you hit the bass drum harder?" You just don't say that shit. Back in those days when recording was new to all these young bands, and they thought you knew more than they did.
Yeah.
And we didn't. Hey, can you hit the bass drum harder? So, and everybody listened to you, and they thought of you as being a part of the group.
Right.
You were there to help them,
Yeah.
and they helped you.
And that's what I loved about that period was, if you were a bass player or a drummer, you spent your life perfecting the bass or the drums and listening to music. And I spent my life dealing with recording. So they didn't have to use that part of their brain. Do you know what I mean? Like they could only focus on the music and you could only focus on the recording side.
Right.
And it was really great. I mean, and that was another thing I think also that Phil was pretty cool about was like, I know I do a horn date. I asked the player where he wants the mic. You know what I mean? That was one thing that Phil taught me. It was like, if you're a bone player, where are you going to be? Where do you want? They've done 1,000 sessions. They know what sounds good,
Yeah, some do. Just one in front of them. But you yourself, I mean, you had so much more going for any of us. I mean, we were there learning how to record and learning from Phil, and that was the most important part. And you were doing the same. However, you had a tech background. You knew so much about tech. None of us did. We only knew what sounded bad. We didn't know how to fix it or how to get there. But, he loved you, man. You were his guy.
Well, I mean, one thing I wanted to definitely insert in this was I was around Phil a lot, and
Yeah.
you are one of the few people that I saw him view as an equal. There was always that, if you came up with Phil, there was always that sort of, hierarchy and level and stuff. And whenever he talked about you, whenever he addressed you, whenever I could always sense that he saw you as an equal, which was pretty cool.
Well, yeah. I mean, it got to the point towards the end where he was referring to me as he'd say, "Oh, remember in the old days when we were growing up?" You know, uh, he was a lot older than me.
Yeah.
I always asked him how old he was, and he would never ever own up to it. He said at some point in my first few months, I asked him, "Gee, how long have you been doing this?" And he told me, "Well, I built the studio in '58, and that's when I started. I didn't really know anything, and I was taught by, oh God, the guy who hosted the A&R site, Win Shortow. He
Right.
gr- he grew up learning from Bill Shortow and a little bit from Tommy Dowd, but things, he said to me in '68 he was 39, and that seemed fair. He looked like he could have been that. I was 21. And a few years later, he did an interview with some magazine, and they had asked him how old he was. And this is years later, he was 39. So never really knew how old he was. And I used to ask Al Schmidt, and he said, "Oh, he's older than me." So
Yeah, for the years I worked with them, back in the office with Laura and Jim and stuff, Phil's age was always a running joke. Like, it was just a moving target. It made no sense. I mean, I remember just one thing that hurt my head was when I was at A&R, we had sweatshirts that were like the 25th anniversary. You know what I mean? I'm going, well, if he started the studio when he's 20, that means he's at least 45 now. And he didn't start the studio when he was 20, you know?
yeah.
And I wanted to ask about that Tom Dowd connection because that name's come up. You had mentioned that in another interview, a connection between Phil and Tom, and I didn't know it. I didn't know if you had any connection with Tom.
I only had a connection with Tom much later on. You know, where Atlantic was pretty much closed. And whatever he was doing at Criteria in Miami. And it was, we were friends. Not great, I wouldn't call Tom every day or every week, but, when we saw each other, it was a friendly relationship. I loved Tom. He was the one thing when I started mixing surround, and I got the tapes from Clapton for Ocean Drive.
Ocean Boulevard, 461 Ocean Boulevard.
Ocean Boulevard, yeah. And I got it was on a hard drive, but the track sheets were in there, and all of his track sheets. It was 16 track, and everything had, if he used EQ, what the EQ was, where it was panned, if he used compression, what he used, where it was. He had everything notated because, and I don't think, whereas when I grew up, we used to do that because if somebody at Atlantic or some other studio got the tapes from us, we wanted them to know what we did and get it done the same way.
Yeah.
But I think in this case, he was doing it because he knew that maybe these guys would want to do it again,
Right.
So he wanted to start off in the same place. But Phil and Tom were great friends. They were really good friends. I'd have to say the best friends were Tom and Al, and they were like brothers.
Yeah.
And Al learned everything from Tom, whereas Phil was with Shorthow.
Right.
So, it came from the same school. They all did the same thing. You had a 4-track tape, you could only do it one way. You had a 16 input console. Who's going to be wide together? Oh, we can put the 2 electric guitars on one fader.
Right.
And you'd sit there and do that and ask one guitar player to turn down this level.
Yeah. I remember even when Swedin did The Wiz, I don't know how big that orchestra was, but it was that Neve 8068. It was 32 inputs. I don't know, how many did A1 hold? 60, 80, 60 maybe? It was jammed. I mean, you couldn't walk out between the chairs.
Right.
And we built mult boxes, resistive boxes, and just jammed like 4 percussion mics, 3 keyboard mics, like all the, 3 mics coming in on 1 mic preamp and 1 fader, it was crazy.
Yeah. It was different. You were an engineer back then, and everything that came with it, it was your obligation to make it happen. And, the one thing Phil told me at one point when I was engineering, and I was working with a band from Colorado who weren't that great, but they had a deal and they had a lot of money. They gave a lot of money to do this. And my first day in there, the drummer comes in and we spend a couple hours on drum sounds. And this is in the 70s. And, I had won my first Grammy, and that was a big deal. And that was still when it meant a lot.
Was this Asia or before?
Yeah, that was after Asia.
Right.
And so I get this drum sound, and then the lead singer comes in, who's the leader of the band, and he said, "Oh, I don't like that. That's not what I want." And, here I am, thinking, oh, well, that's what people come to me for drums. And I said, well, this is what I do. You don't like this? And we didn't get along. It wasn't good. And I went and told Phil about what had happened, and he looked at me in the face and he said, "You're a soldier. you know, your name is not on this record, or at least the front. You know, you're nobody. You have to do what they want, and that's your obligation. And from that moment on, life changed for me. I mean, I was a different guy after that conversation. I never, ever would say anything bad to a second in front of a client. And I didn't do that much to begin with, but there were moments when, why are you doing this? How can you do this? You know, and I learned you can't do that.
Yeah, no, and it took me a while to get that out of my system too. I was a bit of a hothead, but you know, like I remember the one thing about Phil was he was a hothead and he could be brutal, but he always kept the vibe in the studio with the artist cool. Do you know what I mean? He was never blowing up and losing his shit when the artist was in the room, and so I could make a mistake, and I could get destroyed for it afterwards. But what I loved about him was, and I remember this clearly, I'd be punching in and out all day recording a vocal, and I would clip something, and he would just lean down and go, "You want that?" And I go, "Yeah." He wouldn't even look like, you know, and then he would just say to the artist, "Hey man, that sounded so great in the chorus. Why don't you pick up the last line of the verse leading into that?" You know, and the artist never knew that track was wiped, you know, and a mistake was made.
Yeah, he was good about that. And that was later on. You know, at the beginning, he was hot.
Well, like I said, I've had a couple things thrown at me.
You know, at the old building, he had gotten divorced before I got there from his first wife. He'd tell me about who he was expecting to come to the studio that night. And one night, you know, it was Ethel Kennedy and Everett Dirksen and, you know, all these famous people. And then one night, he said, "I have a date later. She'll be here. You know, I want you to go out and bring her into the control room, sit her on the couch in front of the console." "Okay, who's that?" "Natalie Wood."
Oh,
You know, I'm sitting here, Natalie.
whoa.
Yeah, it was intense. You know, he'd just have people drop up and be a part of everything.
Yeah, I remember one night, I think Nielsen stopped by. You know, just
Right.
stuff like that happening was just
You know,
crazy.
we did Nilsson for Midnight Cowboy.
Right. Now, did you work on that as well?
Yeah, and I was still, I was an engineer and working a lot, but he would call me when he was nervous. And he said, "Can you come and help me tonight?" And I didn't do anything except make sure it said it was cool and just stand around.
Well, that's like Sinatra, L.A. is my lady.
Yeah.
Phil crushed me on that one. Oh, man, did he set me up. He put me out in the live room with a big Amic desk, right? And I was doing headphone submixes. But the only thing I was getting was what you could send off that Neve 8068. So you had the rear quad buses. That's two things you could send. He needed a reverb. He had to have a stereo. He had to have a cue for Sinatra and a reverb. So I was down to I had this big console with 5 elements on it. And when the date started, he turns to the whole band on the talkback and goes, "If any of you have a problem with headphones, talk to him," and points to me. And I have no control over anything. I have volume. Here's drums, horns. You know, Dad is going, "Brad, please, man, can I have some more hi-hat?" And there wasn't shit I could do about it, you know.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just wanted to jump back to one point, which is, so if somebody, but you did. I mean, how many inputs did you have when you were working on 48th Street? That must have been not many.
At 112?
Is that that's the original over Jim and Andy's? Yeah, 112.
Yeah, a 16.
All right. So, but I mean, so when you were doing like the Van Morrison drums, was that, well, that's a 32 input. That's a lot of inputs on the Neumann. But did you have like a full 8 mic complement, or was it like a 3 mic thing?
No, because we were still only using a mono overhead.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah.
And was it still, when I was at A&R, there was always an A1, one of the few tube mics we had, a Telefunken 251 that was always on a starboard stand.
That was it.
And so was there not a kick mic also, or just the over?
Yeah, there was. Like for Phil, all he would use was 251 and 666 for the bass drum, and that was it. And he would mic the bass drum on the beater side.
Oh God, I hate doing that.
Yeah, me too.
I can't get a sound on that.
Yeah.
All right, now back in the mono piano days, were you doing that? You know, at A&R, I saw a lot. It was mostly on jingle days, but like the third hold down on the harp, you stick a mic in there. Was that a mono piano back then, or was it something classier than that?
I think it was the first.
The first hole?
Yeah, the one closest to the keyboard.
Yeah.
It was that hole, and it was always a C60, and you shove the C60 even with the
Harp.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, yeah. And bass would have been just. Did you use an amp or just direct?
Direct. They didn't even use an amp.
Yeah, well, yeah. I do a lot of mixing where one of the two faders is up. You know, it's always been we'll record them both, but now, you know, one instrument that I've had a hard time occasionally recording is acoustic guitar. You have any? The two things I find hardest to record frequently are floor tom and acoustic guitar.
Okay, I have the answer for both.
Excellent.
For floor tom, do you use ATs, Audio Technicas?
I do sometimes, yeah.
They made a mic called the ATM 25. All you do is place it on tom. You don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
It's golden. It took me till I started working with the Eagles to know what to do about acoustic, because it was always a problem, and it was usually a problem because you didn't know how the guy was going to play.
Yeah.
You know, like I think on Van I used an 87, you know, and I think back to that now and going, was I nuts? I mean, what was I doing with that? But what I use always is a Shure SM81.
Oh, yeah, I love that mic. And I hear that's your hi-hat mic too, right?
No, I've been using a 451.
All right. All right, so SM81. Are they still manufactured? Do you know?
Yeah. They were expensive though now. You know, it was a $50 mic.
That was an electric, yeah. That electric. Oh, cool. Yeah, but I also remember, you know, with everybody collecting vintage gear and microphones and all this shit and paying a fortune, I remember A&R's mic selection as being very meat and potatoes.
Yeah, but it wasn't. When I came there, everything was 47s, 48s, 251s, 67s. It was amazing. And then at some point, when I got there, Phil told all the engineers, I'm going to sell these mics. I'm going to get only 87s. He said 87s are great for vocals, horns, drum overheads. I mean, he wanted 87s on everything, and that's pretty much what everybody did. By the time you stopped working there, you were so thankful to use other mics.
Yeah, no, because I remember it was 87s, 421s, KM84s, a few 47 FETs, and the one mic I did love was either the C37 or the C38.
The Sony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were sweet.
Well, I about 2 years ago, I went up to the studio in Rhinebeck, and I brought. I had been using a Beta 52 for the foot for a long time, and it was okay. You'd have to EQ it a little bit, but it was all right. He said, "Look, I have this mic. Why don't you try it?" It's called a D30. And basically, well, he put it in. I had it on the kick. The kick had a small hole in it, but the mic was too big to put anywhere really near the hole. And I just put it somewhat near, and he started to play the kick, and I opened up the fader. It was in the console's in the 8058 that's in prime condition. I opened the fader, and I couldn't believe what it sounded like. I had never heard a bass drum sound that way.
Now wait a minute. This isn't the record that you just did? The Madeleine Perot?
Yeah.
Oh, I noticed the kick sound at the beginning of the first track. It's fat, it's round, it's big, but it's punchy without being clicky. Oh,
And
yeah.
no EQ. I just opened the fader.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that kick sound.
It was, the mic was manufactured between 58 and 60, and it was only European distribution. We never had this here. Somebody must have brought one over sometime. It was a $50 microphone or $75 back then, and it was basically two D12s in series.
Wow.
That's all it is. And it's in a case that's about that big. And it's amazing. And I said, where can I get one of these? He said, you'll have to come here every time. I said, I will.
Yeah, because it had a bit more presence than I would associate with the D12s. Were just always a little dull.
Yeah,
for
you're
me,
right.
You know, well, it's a great sounding record. Where did you record it?
In Rhinebeck at the clubhouse. You would fucking love this place.
I think I saw it on the cover of Mix magazine a couple months ago.
Yeah.
I'll have to go up and take a look. Is that near you? Oh no, that's a pretty good haul for you, isn't it?
It's an hour and 20 for me, and for you, by car, it's about the same. Are you in the city?
Yeah, I'm in Manhattan. I'm down in the village.
A little more than an hour and 10 probably for you.
Well, it's got an 8068 or 8058. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, nobody had to ever make another console. I was ruined. That's what I started on. Oh, you turn the EQs, they sound good. They should have just stopped there.
Yeah, I agree.